Welcome to Commander Central, episode 225, and today we'll be taking a look at listener and patron supporter Brandon Hunter's Oketra Prison Warder deck. I'm Dana.
I'm Max.
And I'm Chris.
Max and Chris, how y'all doing today?
Wonderful.
Just fine and dandy.
It's a beautiful autumn afternoon, Friday afternoon here when we're recording this show. Getting ready to go into the weekend where our work days are almost finished, so my goal is to not do a whole lot this weekend, really. I need to recover from this week, so my goal is to just keep it kind of simple.
I definitely agree with that.
How about you, Chris? Anything exciting going on?
I'm going fishing tomorrow.
Oh, nice.
You know,
boat fishing or shore fishing?
Boat fishing.
Taking your son out?
No, actually a guy that you know, who's actually my fishing buddy, we're going to go out. I'm taking Frank out, so.
Oh, nice.
Nice. Yeah, don't sink the boat.
No. I still don't even know if we're taking my boat or his boat. I don't know. It's like one of those things where I got to get a hold of him today and be like, so what was the plan? Which one do you want to take? Mine or yours?
And Max's comment is based on the fact that our friend Frank has in fact sank a fishing boat in the past.
A brand new one, too.
It wasn't his fault. It was his brother. It was his brother-in-law's boat. I remember that.
In his defense, it was not his fault.
Yeah, that was like 2 years ago on an Easter, because I remember getting a phone call from him like, okay, I'll answer. I answered, and he's like, hey, what you doing? You want to help me find a sunken boat? And I'm like, oh, no.
It's like a
Easter
treasure
too,
hunt.
So it's nice and cold and miserable out.
Oh, it was not warm, I'll tell you that.
Well, hey, with no kids, then at least you can drink a little more and probably get a little more fishing done as well.
Right.
So that'll be all right. Well, how about games? Anybody get any games played? I think Max got to do a little bit of streaming this week.
I did. I was invited onto Brainstorm Brewery's Wednesday night game session. Got to play with Jason, DJ, and Kendra Smith, otherwise known as the Maverick Girl on Twitter. We played 2 games. We streamed on YouTube. It was a lot of fun. DJ took both games just because he played an aggro deck. Aggro rogues in game 1, which just Dramoka couldn't keep up with. And then the second game, he did a combo with Selenia, the angel, the life angel. So,
well, sure, where you could pay life to bounce through your hand, and usually you just then stack multiple of those triggers to knock your life total down. Okay.
Yeah, so he ended up winning that way he stacked all the triggers, and then he was playing the enchantment where at the beginning of your turn, if you have 1 life, you win the game, and we couldn't get rid of that before he did all the fun, janky combo stuff.
Nice.
What about you? How were your games with EDH Dana?
We had some good games. We played with Ellie the Veil on Wednesday as well, which and the whole thing was kind of funny because you were playing simultaneously over on the Brainstorm Brewery stream. Ellie had just guested on BSB Monday night. So we were talking about, the Brainstorm Brewery people, and you from my podcast was playing with them while my other podcast was streaming. And then
you heard that, everybody, his other podcast.
Yeah. Well, and then to add another layer to it, their editor was in the hospital this week. So she was editing their show, this week's Brainstorm Brewery show, and she was editing it while we were playing. So there was a whole lot of weird Commander Central, Brainstorm Brewery, EDH Recast, intermingling stuff going on that night. But the games are pretty good. I played my Vela deck in the first one and just got housed by a Merciless Eviction set to artifacts. I don't think I had I think at the time, I don't think I had a single thing in play that wasn't an artifact other than my lands. So I lost everything and just had to, but I was at like 70 life or something too. So it took like 4 turns to kill me. But yeah, there was no coming back from that at that point. And second game, my Sphinx deck kicked off because Joey was playing his K&T deck, which has a lot of draw in it. And I hit him on turn 4 with Psychic Possession. So whenever he draws a card, I draw a card. And at that point, he's like, well, I can either just not play my spells or I can, hope someone deals with Dana. And I drew, down. Like, in addition to that, then like I did like a turn 6 Sphinx's Rev to draw 10. And I was drawing, 5 a turn anyway. And it just got out of control.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun to watch. I jumped in and watched most of that game. I pretty much logged off when I'm like, well, unless something really drastic happens, I feel like Dana has this one in the bag. When I saw the Psychic Possession, the Sphinx's Rev, it was very beautiful to watch.
Yeah, I was in the driver's seat most of that game. But yeah, we had some fun ones, so that was nice. And Chris, your camera arm showed up today, but not your webcam yet. So
Oh,
Hopefully in the next couple days we'll get the webcam in for you as well, and you can start getting a few in here or there when you have time.
Oh, I'm gonna jam as many as I can when my kid's in
Nice.
school, because I have him for he's all virtual, so he's at home all day.
Okay.
I'd just be like, oh, he's in school. I'm gonna go online and be like, hey, guess what? I'm online. I'm gonna play who's not busy today.
Nice.
There are always people looking during the day in our Slack for games all day long, so you will not have an issue with that.
Okay.
No, for sure. And Spell Table, Chris, is super easy to use. I know you've never used it, but it's super, like you'll figure it out in 2 minutes. Really easy.
I think it's gonna
for anyone who hasn't done it out there, absolutely try Spell Table. Super useful.
I think it's gonna bother me to no end not actually being able to like see my opponents and stuff, because I like to judge people like their facial expressions and stuff, and be like, nope, you're lying. I don't believe you.
Well, there's some little stuff, like it's really easy to miss planeswalkers. At least for me, I always forget what loyalty they're at or what their ult is, and so I've really tend to screw planeswalkers up way more over webcam than I do in person. So there are little things like that are definitely different. Some cards just don't play well because, obviously you can't, if you're playing a Gonti deck, that's a pain in the butt trying to look at the top 4 cards of someone's library and not let anybody see what they are.
Yep.
Some things are definitely challenging.
That's definitely interesting, because that actually happened to me when I was playing with BSB this week. I got hit with a rogue that lets you exile 3 cards from that player's library, and DJ just goes, take out your 3 board wipes and we'll call it good. I'm like, are you sure? I can just send you the deck list because it's on Architect if you want to know.
Yeah, there's definitely a few of those.
Right. My biggest thing, Chris, and I think you might feel the same way as me, I've finally gotten used to not being able to touch someone's card with a Swords to Plowshares or a Path to Exile, like you would in person, just be like, ha ha ha, I gotcha. And now it's more like, here, I'm showing you my card, make that go away.
Yep.
It's not as fun. Yeah, for sure. But it's better than nothing. I've really enjoyed at least having the opportunity, because there for a while we just weren't playing at all. And now also it gives you a chance to play people that you wouldn't normally play with, which is really nice too. So definitely a good experience, and we'll get Chris hooked up here in the very, very near future to do that. If you in listener land would like to reach out to us and say hello, tell us about your webcam experiences, or talk about anything at all, how would you do that, Chris?
You can find us on multitude of social media platforms. We'll start off with Twitter, where we seem to be the most active by far. Like this week, I got this random Twitter thing about all of a sudden Tolarian Community College is doing something, and we jumped on board, and I'm like, oh boy, what happened? So on that Twitter aspect, you can find us at CMDR Central. You can search us up on Facebook, CMDR Central, and you can find us online at cmdrcentral.com.
You can also head over to patreon.com/CMDR Central to check out our reward tiers, such as a Decks You Play episode, just like this one, along with some other stuff like our Planeswalker cards. So if you are so inclined to support us financially, we greatly appreciate that. We want to say thank you to our new patron, Cody, along with all of our current patrons, past patrons, and anyone who just listens to us and gives us that upvote, the Apple Podcast review, our YouTube comment. It goes a long way to bringing more visibility to the show.
It definitely makes a big difference. We really appreciate it. Even if the only way you can support us is by listening or clicking like or upvoting us somewhere, that support matters a lot too. So any help you can give, we do appreciate it from everyone out there. And Chris just briefly mentioned the Tolarian Community College thing. The professor was trying to raise some money, and he had posted something where he was trying to raise some cash for an organization called Trans Lifeline, and it just kind of blew up. He wound up raising over $100,000 over the course of just a couple days, and we contributed 4 Brawl decks to that he wound up giving away or kind of auctioning off. Someone named Thomas Making, it looks like, is the person that won them, because I need to ship those out in the next few days. So we contributed a little bit to that, and that felt kind of nice. But yeah, that was crazy to see the community really step up over the weekend or over the week and put together that kind of money for an organization. So that was very cool.
Yeah, that was pretty awesome.
Yeah, super cool to see, especially after the drama that was occurring the weekend before this. So
it was we had a drama-filled week last week, and this week it was nice to see the drama give way to something that was that felt pretty good. So
yeah,
I have no clue what you guys are talking about.
And that's where we're going to leave that.
We'll just leave it at that, absolutely.
What are you guys talking about? I want a baseball bat wrapped in barbed wire.
Oh,
we're just going to walk away from this conversation.
We're going to have integrity and walk away. So before we get started at looking at Brandon's deck, we want to have a contest winner to announce. We were giving away the Dark book on Twitter. So we want to say congratulations to Universal Zeal at Universal Zeal for winning the book. We'll DM you and get some mailing information. We'll get that out in the mail as soon as we can. And then we also want to announce our new Patreon contest for this month. Patron supporter and great community member Draco Lucian has donated his Zada Hedron Grinder gumball deck that he built for the Gumball Challenge that our community and CCO's community kind of did together. So he has sent me the deck. I have all the cards. Is ready to go out. So the winner, if you are a current patron supporter or become one by the end of October, you will be entered to win that entire deck, and I'll ship it out to you, and it's a lot of fun to play. I got to see it in action once. I've played against more highly tuned Zada decks, and this one definitely holds its own right up against those two, just because of how good Zada is.
Super cool. Well, thank you, Draco Lucian. We really appreciate that. That's awful generous of you, and that'll be nice to send that deck off to patron supporters so someone else can enjoy playing it. So speaking of patron supporters, we're going to be taking a look at patron supporter and listener Brandon Hunter's Oketra Prison Warden deck here today. And when we do these, we usually have a few questions we ask about the deck of the listener in question. So Max, why don't you start us off here?
As always, we always ask, what is the listener's meta like? And Brandon says it varies from super casual jank all the way to CEDH. He doesn't have very many token-based strategies in his meta, which is why he can get away with some of the inclusions in the deck as well. We then ask what the goal of the deck is, and the goal today is to lock down his opponents long enough to get to the late game where he can get the value engine rolling, and then he occasionally does get a win with commander damage off of Oketra.
That is a tall feat. That is a very tall feat. Whew. So another question that we always ask is, what is a weakness or like areas in general that we should focus on? So big difficulty is getting in the finishing blow with this deck. The deck tends to get plenty of bodies and damage out on the board, but getting in to deal the final strike seems to be where everything is lacking. Another thing we always ask is budget limits, because not everyone can afford, a $500 dual land like, some other people I know. Dana. Sorry, Dana, I love you.
You just have to sell a kidney here or there.
As of right now, no budget, because you can acquire cards over time, or as he told us, he has a fairly decent sized collection, so you may already have some of the suggested cards.
And his final note here he threw in for us is, without a better term, he said this is kind of a Dana special deck, where he tried to find cards outside of what is generally recommended by EHREC. He's running things like Umbilicus and Blood Clock, that I'm sure we'll talk about here, that work really well against non-token decks. There are also some very non-linear combos he's come across with this deck, which may explain some of the choices and additions like Luminous Broodmoth, Solemnity, and a Sack Outlet. So let's just kind of dive right in here and take a look at this deck. God Eternal Oketra to start with here is a commander that was in War of the Spark. It is a zombie god for 3 white, and it's a 3/6 with double strike. So the commander damage thing is relatively tricky because there's no evasion, but with double strike, you are in a 4-turn clock, so you can kill somebody in 4 hits. If you add much at all to that Oketra, even if you make her a 4, then you're dealing 8, so then it becomes a 3-turn clock. So the double strike makes a big difference. There's still the issue of lack of evasion, though, so I can see how you can occasionally kill somebody with commander damage, but it probably isn't the kind of thing you want to rely on too much. In addition to double strike, whenever you cast a creature spell, create a 4/4 black zombie warrior creature token with vigilance. And as with all of these God Eternals, whenever God Eternal Oketra dies or is put into exile from the battlefield, you may put it into its owner's library 3rd from the top. So that's slightly less useful on your commander where you're going to get it back anyway, but still it's a way to get around the command tax, particularly if you know you're going to be able to dig down relatively quickly. So not entirely a useless ability, although it's not quite as good on a commander as it is elsewhere. Max, why don't you start us out here with going over the land base?
Will do. There are 34 lands in this deck. We have an Emeria the Sky Ruin, which is not really played as often anymore, so I'll read it quick. It enters the battlefield tapped at the beginning of your upkeep. If you control 7 or more planes, you may return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield, and it taps for a white mana. There's also a Reliquary Tower, a Rogue's Passage, and 31 snow-covered plains.
So the Rogue's Passage is one of the ways you can get through with the Oketra. So there's plenty of reasons to run that many basic lands in a monocolor deck like this. Maybe you just see a ton of Blood Moon effects, although I think you can still get away with more non-basics even if you do that. But the main one is a lot of times you see these kind of decks tend to run a bunch of things that double the mana your basics produce, like Extraplanar Lands or Cage Sun. However, there's only one of those in this deck. There's the extra planar lens, there isn't the Cage Sun, there isn't the Gauntlet. So that's useful, but I feel like you could very easily replace 4 or 5 of these snow-covered plains with good utility lands and really not have a problem with that cramping the style of your extra planar lens all that often. What do you guys think of that?
Oh, I have a huge list of things I would do with this land base.
So what would you add here, Chris? I mean, obviously we always tend to say, like, run a few land removal lands like Strip Mine or Wasteland or whatever, and run Scavenger Grounds. So we'll skip past those because we always say to do those. But are there any ones that you would in particular like to see here?
I would personally take out the extra planar lens in the deck, seeing how it is only one source of it, which then allows you to not be so focused on having all snow lands.
Sure.
So I was thinking half snow, half regular, because I'm a huge fan of Field of the Dead. And in a monocolored deck, you're allowed more utility lands in general. So you can play like a Mistvale Plains, Nykthos, Core Haven, a Maze of Ith because you're trying to stall out the game till mid-game or late game, Glacial Chasm. I mean, any of those cards are really good. Not to mention a lot of the new cards have come out, like Castle Ardenvale, I think it is, the white one. Mm-hmm. Those kinds of cards could be put in here that still create your white mana that you need, but they're utility lands that can do other stuff as well.
Yeah, for sure. How about you, Max? What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with a lot of what Chris said. The big thing for me is having a Nykthos will do this deck wonders just because it is very permanent based.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of white pips on this screen when I'm looking at it, so Nykthos would probably be my number one include if you're looking for one thing to add is slot a Nykthos into this deck for sure.
Yeah, and it's definitely a pricey card these days. You know, not that many months ago, or at least not that many years ago, it was a $6-ish card. It's a $25-ish card now, so it's much trickier to put in a deck. But still, if you are not super worried about your budget, it's really, really strong, particularly in a monocolor deck like this. So that would be definitely one I would agree with for sure. I also kind of like the new Amiria Shattered Skyclave and / Amiria's Call here. That was the MDFC mythic from the Zendikar Rising set we just got. And it's the one that when you cast a spell portion of it, you make 2 4/4 angels and you make your creatures indestructible.
Yep.
Again, this deck is white. You have a little bit of life gain in here, so you can tend to afford to pay the 3 if you need to. If you don't, it just comes into play tapped. You know, if it's turn 7 and you draw it, then you're just going to get some free angels out of it. I think this is a really good deck for that particular card.
Especially since it's monocolor, so you're not really losing out on anything.
Yeah. So, and it makes you white anyway, so like there's just not a lot of downside to it in this particular deck, particularly since there's a few token synergies as well, and these make tokens. Yeah, they're not zombie tokens, but they are flyers too, which is kind of a nice thing to help you poke through some damage. So I would like that here. Hall of Heliod's Generosity, I think I would be very tempted to run here. This deck doesn't have a ton of enchantments, but there are some in here that are really, really good. And just getting back that Smothering Tithe or that True Conviction or that Solemnity or even a Darksteel Mutation if there's some big creature in play to guarantee you can draw it and then use it that turn for some big effect, it's almost always worthwhile. I've kind of found if your deck is running 1 or 2 enchantments that can basically win you the game if they hit the field, then it's worth having it out. Or worth having it in your deck. I think especially in this kind of deck where you're not going to really be bothered by it making colorless mana.
Yes.
I think there's just no downside to it, and I would definitely run it. I like Core Haven, which you mentioned. Maze of Ith doesn't tap for mana, so it's a little bit trickier, but like Core Haven, there's just no downside to it, and I would still probably be tempted to try Maze of Ith. So yeah, I agree. Yep. I would definitely run more utility lands here from that, the 6 or 8 or 10 we just mentioned.
Yeah, because I mean, unless Blood Moon is a huge thing in the meta,
right?
Which I'm guessing by the way that he described his meta, it's not. You can still get away from it, and you don't really need 31 basic lands, unless you're playing all the mana doublers in the artifact section. Because I've played, people's decks who only play like 6 basic lands and still play off just fine.
Yeah. I mean, it's not ideal. I would prefer not to have 6 basic lands in my 3-color deck. Because that's what I have in my 3-color deck is 6 basics, and that's not good. I'm not going to tell anyone to do that. But I will say this, even, we have a couple players in our meta in the shop that play Blood Moon, and I've been okay playing that deck against them, and I've gotten burned once or twice, and I've also not gotten burned 3 or 4 times, and because I just didn't draw it, and then all the other games I didn't get burned at all when no one had a Blood Moon out. Yep. So, I mean, it's not ideal, but like you absolutely can survive it in that situation. And here, this is still going to have 24 basics, even if you take
easily
7 of these.
Yeah.
you'll still be fine. So we talked about a few artifacts here. Chris, why don't we go over the artifacts that are in the deck?
All right, there are 12 artifacts in the deck. We have Aetherflux Reservoir, Blood Clock, Cloudstone Curio, Extraplanar Lens, Oketra's Monument, Pearl Medallion, Phyrexian Altar, Ronus's Monument, Scroll Rack, Slate of Ancestry, Soul Ring, and Umbiliculus. I don't even know how to pronounce that, but it's an old artifact from Urza Saga. So
from Urza's gears, as I always.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure
I can never remember what's one.
I'm pretty sure that's Saga. I could be wrong.
It is Saga.
I think
You are
it is,
correct.
yeah. So Aetherflux Reservoir is just generally a useful card, particularly in a deck that has a little bit of life gain synergy, or one that's, planning on casting a good amount of spells in a single turn.
Yep.
So that's a win condition unto itself. They're sitting as a 4-mana artifact. That's nice. Blood Clock we mentioned when we were introing the deck. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player returns a permanent he or she controls to its owner's hand unless he or she pays 2 life. Similarly, we have Umbilicus. During each player's upkeep, that player pays 2 life or returns a permanent he or she controls to owner's hand. So very similar cards. The wording is slightly different, but they basically play the same way. The logic here, I'm guessing, is people probably are just going to either lose 2 life most of the time, and you yourself very often are going to bounce back your Martyr of Sands or your Mother of Ruins or some cheap creature you have in play that you can then replay it to get another zombie off Oketra.
Yep.
The danger with these 2 cards is your opponents probably most of the time are either going to pay the 2 life, which isn't, it's not nothing, but it's not that damaging, or they're going to bounce back something you don't want them bounce so they can recast it like an Eternal Witness.
Yeah.
Like what you don't want to see Umbilicus or Blood Clock come down when someone has a Grey Merchant. You play Blood Clock, pass a turn, they play Grey Merchant, that's bad. That's a bad situation.
That's when you hope that you have something to destroy your Blood Clock. You're just like, no, get rid of it.
Your own enchantment, yeah. But I do kind of appreciate such a daring strategy too, even if it does burn you. I can respect that. The one card I would maybe consider to supplement these in your artifacts is Erratic Portal. In Erratic Portal, you can tap it and it bounces a permanent unless the opponent plays 1, unless the target player pays 1. So, number 1, it makes everyone feel like they kind of have to always leave 1 mana up, which is really annoying. Like, that really does kind of screw up your turn sometimes when you feel like, I can't tap out because if I do, I'm going to get something bounced I don't want to have bounced. But number 2, it's much easier if all you really care about for the most part is targeting yourself, then you don't have to worry about someone bouncing that Grey Merchant or that Eternal Witness. You can just hit yourself with it, not pay the 1 because it's your choice, and bounce it back to your hand. So that's one I would consider in addition to these, or maybe replacing one of them just because it's a little bit less dangerous and kind of does the same thing. We have 2 monuments here, the white one and the black one, Oketra's and Ronus's monument. White creature spells that you cast cost 1 less. Excuse me, that's the Ronus's monument is actually the green one. Oketra's white creature spells cost 1 less. Whenever you cast a creature spell, create a 1/1 white warrior. So there's a lot of creatures in this deck. You're going to be bouncing them to recasting, which is making you more token bodies. And Ronus's, whenever you cast a creature spell, creatures you control get +2/+2 and trample until end of turn. So maybe another way to let Oketra poke through for some damage by giving her trample and buffing her up with double strike. Those are actually both really useful cards here. I like them both. Scroll Rack obviously is great, which is why it's so expensive. And we'll talk about land tax under enchantments, which it works really nice with there. But the last weird one is Slate of Ancestry. 4 mana to cast, and you can spend 4 mana to discard your hand and draw a card for each creature you control.
So it's kind of
really
like a
wheel a little bit.
Yeah, that seems really good.
In this deck where you're making tokens and you have a bunch of creature spells, I would guess that's really, really effective.
Yes.
So any ones you guys particularly like or dislike among this group of artifacts? Or anything well, first we'll talk about just things you really like or don't like, and then we can talk about some maybe suggestions here for it. How about you, Max? We'll start.
I really like the inclusion of Ronus's monument. I feel like people sometimes don't include the other monuments since they don't run that color, but
right.
The effect doesn't care about what color, they just wants a creature spell. So this is a great way for mono white decks to pump a big beater, pump a few beaters because you have a bunch of little bodies, or pump your commander, like you said, with Oketra and double strike and trample. You're going to push through a lot of damage typically.
Yeah, I think it's really easy to forget that you can run the monuments from gods of other colors because they don't make mana of those colors. They just reduce the cost, but the ability doesn't care about the creature. It just cares about creatures. So yeah, it's an easy one to forget, but I think I like that here as well in this deck. How about you, Chris? Anything you like or kind of don't like here?
Well, see, I like Ronus's Monument, but I don't like it at the same time due to the simple fact that it only targets one creature. You don't get to target multiples. So you get too focused on putting it onto one creature and the way that I look at this deck is it seems that it's more of a weenie type deck, weenie token deck. So it's not really valuing you overall. Personally, I would replace that with like a Hazoret's Monument, where whenever you cast a creature spell, you may discard a card and then draw a card. So let's say you have the land tax that we just talked about. You have 3 lands in your hand. I'll discard a land to draw a card.
That's a good point. Lets you filter down real quickly.
Yep.
Yeah.
Because that is a big downfall in white, is lack of card draw, which Slate of Ancestry does something wonderful with it. Another one I was thinking about, and this is a newer card, and I know he did say that he didn't like, like the cards that everyone would be playing, but this card I think plays too well in this deck to not be playing, and that's Idol of Endurance, which is a 3-mana artifact from M21. When Idol of Endurance enters the battlefield, exile all creature cards with converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard until Idol of Endurance leaves the battlefield. So then they'll end up back in the graveyard if this gets destroyed. So for 1 colorless and 1 white, tap it. Until end of turn, you may cast a creature spell from among the cards exiled with Idol of Endurance without paying its mana cost. So this is allowing you to use your graveyard as well to get triggers off of Oketra. Because I noticed that there's not a whole lot of graveyard recursion, so once these creatures hit the battlefield and say they get wrathed out, you're not really getting any value, overall from the graveyard. So might as well find something that you can use to do that kind of thing, and that actually fits perfectly.
That's a good card here in this deck. That makes sense.
That's
Especially
a great card.
Yeah, seeing how the CMC is so low on majority of like the creature base, which we'll discuss here in a little bit, but the ability to bring back, 97% of them is huge.
Yeah, I mean, I did the math for a recommendation for creatures, but there are 20 creatures in this deck that have 3 CMC or less. So, if 3 or 4 of them are in your yard, that's 4 more cards you get to cast. Like Chris said, this is a great include, Chris. I like it a lot.
Yeah, now maybe, you may cast like Mother Runes or whatever, for 2 mana getting it back, so you're actually losing out on that, but you need to find a recursion outlet because once you get blown out once, it's hard to, recur yourself in mono white.
Yeah, good call. One I kind of think would do good work here is Idol of Oblivion. That was in the Gear Red banner deck 2 years ago, I think. It's a two mana artifact, and you can just tap it to draw a card, and you can activate this ability only if you created a token this turn. I feel like in this deck, it's basically going to be tap to draw a card most of the time.
Oh, that's pretty good.
And you can also spend 8 to sacrifice it to create a 10/10 colorless Eldrazi creature token, which, you're not going to use that often. I think you're going to find most of the time just drawing a card is better than making the Eldrazi, but having that option's nice too. I think, however, it's good enough in this particular kind of deck to probably run, even if it was only the card draw. So that's kind of just a little bit of extra on top of it. But I think in white, where you're always kind of hurting for draw, that's legitimately a really, really good card.
Yep. Another one that I had in mind too was the Immortal Sun.
Oh, sure.
Due to the simple fact that since we haven't really discussed this at all in this deck runs no Planeswalkers.
Yeah.
So it's not going to hurt you with the Planeswalker issue of it, but it's going to reduce the cost of all your spells. You're going to get an additional card, and it's going to pump your creatures. All 3 of those modes in white that's phenomenal in general.
That's really good synergy here as well in a deck that's probably going to kind of go wide and kind of needs draw.
Yep.
And you don't mind shutting down Planeswalkers because it's not going to hurt yours at all.
And his whole game plan, he said, is to kind of stall out in the early game, kind of sit on par with the rest of the table, but then late to mid game, go off. And that card helps later mid game.
Yeah, but it also doesn't feel particularly bad casting it early either if you need to. Because one of the cards I was going to suggest here was Eldrazi Monument, which is 5 mana, gives your creatures flying, indestructible, and +1/+0.
I know that card very well.
Eldrazi Monument, you kind of like don't want to cast until you're at the point where you're probably going to try to win very quickly because you have to sacrifice a creature each turn. Whereas I feel like you don't want to drop it on turn 5 or something and when you're not planning on winning for 6 turns. Well, you can drop the Immortal Sun relatively early and probably maybe even want to just to get the card draw off it. Maybe Immortal Sun is actually better in this particular deck than Eldrazi Monument would be. So I think you've convinced me to just not mention Eldrazi Monument maybe and go with Immortal Sun instead there.
And Immortal Sun turns into a card where it doesn't quite put a target on your back like Eldrazi Monument does. It might shut shut down one player where they're like, oh, I have to get rid of that. But then the rest of the table's like, oh, so we're locking that guy out. Maybe we just, leave that alone. Yeah, he's playing mono white, so what's one extra card a turn going to really do for him?
Yeah, there's definitely situations there where people are like, well, I don't like it, but that person has 2 planeswalkers out that now don't work.
Yep.
So, yeah, no, that's a very good point and a really good card, and this is a good spot for it. I like that. Max, any final artifact stuff from you before we move on here?
No, I'm ready to move on if you guys are.
Sure. So what do we have next, Max?
Let's move over to the sorceries. And there are 7 of them. Austere Command, Dusk to Dawn, Fumigate, Idyllic Tutor, Savine's Reclamation, Shatter the Sky, and Wrath of God. So that's 5 board wipes and a tutor and a recursion spell.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, that's not crazy. 5 board wipes is I don't think I have any decks with 5 currently. I have a couple with 4, I think, but I think 5 isn't out of bounds necessarily. And they are efficient, good board wipes as well. Any thoughts or feelings about any of this from either of you two?
I definitely like the amount of board wipes, knowing that the game plan for probably the first third of the game is just keeping the board under control, stalling out your opponents, So what if you lose a couple creatures or even Oketra, because that's just going to go down a few cards in your library, or you'll draw it in a couple turns. I really like that. I'm not a fan of a couple of them specifically. Like, I'm not a big fan of Fumigate, especially if you're using it early game. That's really has a low floor, high ceiling type of card right there. If you cast it and only kill a couple things, you're only getting a couple life. Now, casting it later in the game where you destroy 10, 12 creatures, that's where you really want to use that card.
It does have a little added synergy with something like Aetherflux Reservoir, maybe. I'm wondering if that isn't the logic here.
Yeah,
not that it isn't a good card, but that helps make it better, I think.
I mean, and there is quite a bit of life gain in this deck just off the bat, so I get why it's in here, and Aetherflux is a win con. Game's got to end, so I understand why it's in here, and I just think there might be more efficient cards to use that will still, you could substitute that for a different creature that has lifelink, and then replace this with a more efficient board wipe.
I'm just generally, I think Savine's Reclamation is kind of a really underappreciated card. For those who don't remember, it was from the Savine Chroniclast Commander deck a couple years back. It's 3 mana, return target permanent card with CMC 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, which is really, really nice. And if the spell was cast from a graveyard, you may copy the spell and choose new targets for the copy, and it has flashback for 4 and a white. So it's not a draw spell, but functionally it kind of works that way. It's letting you put a card from your graveyard into play, and then you can do it basically twice more if you cast it again. So it winds up being essentially three permanents from your graveyard for 8 mana. That's a pretty good deal most of the time. So this is a card I am definitely a fan of and glad to see it showing up here. Real good value. Shatter the Sky is the one I was a little bit unsure of among the board wipes. It's 4 mana, so Wrath of God mana. Each player who controls a creature with power 4 or greater draws a card, then destroy all creatures. I don't know. Yes, it's replacing itself, probably, because your zombies are all 4/4s. But is it worth giving everybody else a card for you to give one? Because there's a pretty good chance at least one other person has a 4/4, if not multiple people.
Yes.
Because if they don't, you're probably, why are you casting it? It's one of those things, like, if people don't have creatures out, you're not casting it. So odds are someone else is drawing cards, and I feel like the amount of times when you're giving away 3 cards or at least 2 cards for the one you're getting, I don't know if that's worth it. Any thoughts from you guys about that one?
I mean, I think the card draw is important here, prior to some of the recommendations we've made already. It's only 1 more mana than Citywide Bust, which does, destroy everything with toughness 4 or greater. So yeah, there's a little bit of a clause where it may not destroy everything on Citywide Bust. This destroys everything, plus giving your opponents a card. So I guess it's, half a dozen of one, half a dozen of the other.
Sure.
It's probably just player's choice at this point. I agree with you. I'm not a big fan of giving my opponents cards, so I would probably choose something like Citywide Bust, or even like Cleansing Nova at, the same mana or 1 more mana, just to hit different things, whether it's creatures or artifacts and enchantments.
Yeah, 1 more mana for Cleansing Nova to have the option, I think, is really, really useful. But yeah, it's not that I think Shadow Sky is bad. I just feel like it's not a choice that feels maybe worth it in this deck. But
I mean, is 4 mana to let your opponents maybe draw a card worth it versus even Day of Judgment at 4 mana?
Right, yeah. I feel like if I really wanted a 4 mana wipe, I would still probably just go with Day of Judgment myself.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're playing a card like Mind's Eye or something, you pay what would that be, 4 + 3, 7 mana, and you net 4 cards if everyone else gets 1. So, I mean,
yeah,
that would be a way to do it, but Mind's Eye is not in the deck, so.
Right. Yeah.
And that's for 3 to 4 mana on top of the 4 you're already paying for this. Who knows if you can have that at the time, because as we just did the artifacts, there's no mana rocks. So like you don't have a Soul Ring to tap to get 2 more cards off that Mind's Eye if it was in here. So, I think it's a cool card. I personally wouldn't run it.
So how about sorceries that you'd like to see in this deck that aren't here?
I mean, we're playing mono white and we need a way to win. I'm perfectly fine with Approach of the Second Sun in this deck, especially on top of what Chris has recommended with, Hazard's Monument, the Scroll Rack, the Idol you recommended, Dana. There could be a lot more draw in this deck to where you could get 7 cards down really quickly after casting Approach. Plus, Approach gains you some life.
Yeah, I think in a mono white deck, you shouldn't feel bad about running cards to win the game. You're just at a disadvantage, and yes, and it's not, I don't think Approach is even played that much. It's not like it's some kind of a Labman combo or anything. It's popular-ish card, but it's not that popular. I think if that's what you're going to run for a win con, I wouldn't feel bad about it. So yeah, it gives you one more way to win a game in a deck that's a little bit control-y. I would be okay with that as well.
Approaches ran in 10,000 decks on EDH Rec, and I can see how many they are in just God Eternal Oketra decks. And plus, you're running Aetherflux Reservoir, so you don't really need to feel bad about running this card either.
Yeah, and hey, you can argue it's on theme because Oketra is from
Amonkhet.
From Amonkhet, where Approach takes place. So that's a. If you need to make the argument, there you go. You've got it.
There are only 22 God Eternal Oketra decks that run Approach of the Second Sun. So
there we go.
Be number 23.
Can still be a hipster with it. All right, so anything final before we hop over and take a look at the creature suite here? All right, let's do this. Chris, you want to read the creatures to us?
Sure, there are 29 creatures in this deck. So we have Archangel of Thune, Aven Mind Sensor, Bastion Protector, Daxos, Blessed by the Sun, Draneth Magistrate, Fiend Hunter, Giver of Runes, Grand Abolisher, Karmic Guide, Knight of the White Orchid, Leonin Arbiter, Luminous Bloodmoth, Mangara, the Diplomat, Martyr of Sands, Mentor of the Meek, Mother of Runes, Ranger of Eos, Ranger Captain of Eos, interesting there, Recruiter of the Guard, Revelark, Selfless Spirit, Sarah Ascendant, Soul Warden, Soul's Attendant, Sun Titan, Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, Thalia, Heretic Cathar, Tithe Taker, and Weathered Wayfarer.
Oof. Okay, so we have a lot of good value creatures, quite a few that have some kind of an ETB that can be taken advantage of with things like Umbilicus or Blood Clock, or if you were to happen to use the Erratic Portal to bounce and replay them as well. So that's something that makes sense here with those creatures. Just a lot of good value, a lot of things that make tokens as well to kind of take advantage of the fact that this deck's probably going wide. Anything particular you guys want to talk about or mention here that stands out at you as kind of a neat inclusion? I can start with you, Max. Anything that you kind of liked?
So typically, I'm not a big fan of like a hate bear-esque deck, just because in EDH, we're here to have fun, but we're playing mono white, so I kind of let it slide a little.
I kind of agree with that as well.
So I really like some of the Hate Bear type cards in this deck, both Thalia's, Tithe Taker, Draneth Magistrate. But I feel like if you really want to make sure you can make it to the end game, you could probably add a few more that aren't super oppressive and still let your opponents have fun. Except for one, because I think Loxodon Gatekeeper is a really cool card because it makes all of your opponent's artifacts, lands, and creatures come in tapped. That is a cool card and probably makes it so nobody else has fun, which sometimes you got to be okay with.
And even the hate bear cards that you mentioned are the ones that are in here. They're all kind of annoying, but they're not Winter Orb level like hate bear where they're really locking down and stopping you from taking your turn. I don't want to see someone cast a Draneth Magistrate, but like it is what it is. You can play around it, and it's going to get removed very quickly. It's on a creature body. Everyone in every color can hit that. So I don't love some of these things, but to play against them. But I think they're all perfectly reasonable, as are the things you mentioned, that they can be dealt with. So I would say no one should feel bad in a mono white deck about slowing everybody else up and stopping them from searching with Aven Mind Sensor or limit how much stuff they can cast with the Magistrate. I think that's completely reasonable in mono white. Any useful commentary from you here, Chris, on any of these?
For sure, I can think of one inclusion of a creature. I noticed this on Max's notes as well, is Adric Lunar Commercial. His ability allows you to give all your creatures, double strike, first strike, whatever your other creatures have. So just having Oketra in the field and dropping him gives all your other creatures double strike on combat. That's and
vigilance, because you made a zombie.
And vigilance from the token too. Yeah.
So I mean, that's really good.
And there's enough other incidental stuff even. I mean, that alone is worth it. Like just having a commander who gives double strike and makes creatures that have vigilance, so that you're gonna have both those spread around really often. But there's so many accidental, like Archangel of Thune with flying and lifelink.
Yep.
There's a good bit of flying on a few of these creatures here. There's a couple, the first strike kind of things. There's enough useful abilities to spread around in addition to the really great ones on your commander that's a really good call from both you guys.
Yeah. So I had another theme in mind for this deck too. I was looking at this deck hard as we were going through it, and I couldn't really, it seemed kind of sporadic, spread out, like some things do this, some things do that. It wasn't really focused. And I was thinking, why not focus harder on ETB creatures in general? So you get double value.
Sure.
You have a creature that enters the battlefield, you get that trigger, or it has a static ability, plus you get a token off of God Eternal. It allows you to broaden, the overall ability of the deck. It also allows you to put in a little side theme into this deck as white, which a lot of people, don't do, but it is known to be able to reanimate creatures. There are a lot of cards that do that. So why not make it, like a sub theme of reanimation? Yes, you're not getting the God Eternal effect, because you're not really casting them, but you're getting another ETB effect off your creature because they all have those abilities built in. So, I mean, you could get double value, and catch people off guard because people are like, oh, okay, so we got God Eternal, so he's going to play all these weenies, get all these tokens, make other tokens, play all these enchantments that buff their tokens and everything. But instead, you're just going, nope, I'm just going to play all this, ETB effects and just take over the game that way.
Yeah, I was going to save this kind of for the end, but I guess we can talk about it now. I very much am on board with that. If I was going to make large scale changes to this deck, that's exactly what I would do. I would definitely go more with the go wide token theme, and I would absolutely go more with creatures that when this comes into play, it makes 2 1/1 soldiers kind of things. And there's a few of those in here, but I would definitely go harder on that particular theme, because then you can keep that kind of erratic portal and blood clock system going and get even more value out of those. So when you're replaying those, you're making more bodies in addition to the Oketra bodies. And then there's a few things I'll mention under enchantments that work really nicely with tokens here too. So I totally agree. If I was going to do a large scale change to this deck, it would be to go way deeper on creatures that make tokens when they come into play. Then you have things like Conjurer's Closet, then you can blink them with, and white has a lot of blink spells on its own that you can run, like Ephemerate, to blink those creatures to get the additional tokens off those bodies. And when a creature ETBs, double the ETB trigger. What's that artifact? I've just forgotten the name now.
Panharmonicon.
There we go. So then there's like Panharmonicon that you can run. So yeah, if I was totally changing, 30 cards out of the deck, that's the direction I would go. So we're completely on the same page.
Yeah, it's just because I'm looking at the creature base overall, and a lot of the creatures already have those abilities built in. So it makes sense to kind of think about it that route and not be so focused on God Eternal itself. That's just bonus value in general. Because then you're not, a 5 mana commander is hard to build your deck completely around without all the mana doublers, which we discussed earlier, and all that stuff.
How about you, Max? What do you think here about the creature suite?
I like it how it is. Like, I kind of like how this deck is, but I totally get change. If you guys want to do mass changes, change it into more of a go wide strategy. One of the few cards I was also going to recommend for how the deck is currently is Bygone Bishop. Similar
that's a good card.
To Chris talking about how many creatures with 3 CMC or less there are. This makes a clue token every time you cast a creature with 3 CMC or less. So it's a slower draw engine than maybe, the Idol or the Sun, but you still get clue tokens, which you can crack at any time you want. And it's a flyer, which helps with Adric and a bunch of other stuff already in the deck.
Yeah.
So I really like that card. And even in a white weenie type deck, whether it's a Hate Bears or maybe a go wide strategy, that's a great card to put into that deck.
Well, speaking of, Bygone Bishop, and it creates a token, that Idol of Oblivion that Dana did recommend, it doesn't say creature token. It just says if you created a token. So if
Correct.
if you create a clue token, and then you're just like, tap that, draw a card, pay 2 mana, draw another card. What's your guys' problem? I'm playing mono white, and I have 40 cards in my hand.
Yeah, and there's a Smothering Tithe already in this. We haven't got to enchantments yet, but there is Smothering Tithe in here, which same thing.
Yep.
It's a token that you're making, so. Completely agree. All right, let's jump over then. I think, what do we have left? Instants and enchantments?
Yeah.
So why don't we quick do instants first? There's 7 of them in this deck. We have Crush Contraband as a removal spell, Enlightened Tutor to go fetch up an enchantment, Lapse of Certainty, which we'll circle back to here in a minute, 2 amazing removal spells in Path to Exile and Swords to Plowshares, Teferi's Protection, which is, everyone knows how disgusting that card is, and Wing Shards.
That is like
Wing
the
Shards.
best card ever. Teferi's Protection, not Wing Shards.
Wing Shards is 3 mana, target player sacrifices an attacking creature, and it has Storm. Lapse of Certainty is super cool. Counter a target spell, it's 3 mana. If that spell is countered this way, put it on top of its owner's library instead of into that player's graveyard. So 3 mana white counterspell, they can get the spell back, but if what they're casting is going to win the game or keep you from winning, you do not care if they get it back. So I think Lapse of Certainty is very cool in mono white decks. I'm glad to see it show up here. Crush Contraband is a really, really solid removal spell. The only thing I would probably have an objection to here is the card Max mentioned as not being Teferi's Protection, and that's Wing Shards. But I guess I can't say I've ever played with it. Maybe it's better than it looks. Have you guys ever used it at all?
I have, but
I've never
really seen it go off. Like, I've seen it hit maybe 2 creatures, but never really more than that.
Yeah, I think it was in one of the precons a few years back that I played in one of the precon leagues, and I remember casting it, but I had no way to get the Storm trigger that turn, so it was just a 3. It was just like just a bad condemn then.
Yep.
And I think the amount of spells you have to be able to cast to make it work is more than I would ever feel comfortable to run it, particularly when, like, for the same exact mana cost, you could just run something like
Generous Gift.
Yeah, right, exactly. For 3 mana and hit anything, even if it wasn't attacking. I feel like Generous Gift is going to always solve a problem. Wing Shards is on occasion going to be a blowout, but on occasion it's going to be a bad 3 mana creature removal spell. Way more often, I would say. So, yeah, Generous Gift would be probably the swap I would make there for sure.
I mean, he does have Flawless Maneuver in the maybe board. That would be a great swap right there.
Sure.
An almost as good Teferi's Protection seems really good over Wing Shards. I just feel like Wing Shards, you need to rely on your opponents to do a lot of the work in mono white, because you aren't going to cast this on one of your creatures when you attack. You're going to use this defensively. So I don't foresee you casting 2 or 3 spells in response to your opponents doing something.
Yeah, like maybe like in a Wrath Capuchin deck or an Afara deck where your deck is built around doing stuff on other people's turns. You're going to have those times when like someone attacks with 4 creatures and you're like, okay, well, I'm going to flash in this Mana Rock and then I'm going to cast this, draw spell, and then I'm going to cast Wing Shards and hit all 3 of your creatures. But I think this isn't that deck. I think this deck is just not going to very often it's just going to be 3 mana to hit one thing, and you're just better off with a couple other options instead. So.
And, we didn't really mention this, but it's target player, so your opponent gets to choose what gets sacrificed. So if they're swinging at you with an Elish Norn and a warrior token, I will be shocked if they sacrifice that Elish Norn, to be honest. So
exactly. The other spell I wouldn't mind seeing here, I think is quite good, is Rootborn Defenses. Instant speed, your stuff gets indestructible, and then you populate. I feel like 3 mana to not only stop a Wrath from happening, or at least stop it from hitting your stuff, but then you make probably what is going to most often be a 4/4 zombie on top of that. I really have tended to like those kind of spells the last year or so. Things like Teferi's Protection or Heroic Intervention, where instead of stopping the board wipe, you let everyone else's stuff die and yours doesn't. So I like that in general, and Rootborn Defenses having populate on it and you having really good tokens. I feel like that's one I would be very tempted to find room for in this deck as well. Even more so if it went more into the go wide portion. So
yep, I agree with that. Personally, when I look at a deck like this, especially mono white in general, these types of decks are played on your turn, not your opponent's turns.
Yeah.
So you want cards that are versatile. So if you're not playing something like what Dana suggested to use as protection, then the card should be versatile, where path is, I can path a creature on my turn. I don't need to wait, until their turn to do it. Get rid of it now so I can kill them on my turn.
Yep. Yeah. Totally in agreement. All right. Shall we jump over to the last section here, the enchantments, Max? What do we have?
We have 10 enchantments total. We have Aura of Silence, Authority of the Consuls, Blind Obedience, Darksteel Mutation, Ghostly Prison, Grasp of Fate, Land Tax, Smothering Tithe, Solemnity, and True Conviction.
So what do you think of the enchantment block, Chris? Anything here that jumps out at you that you like or dislike?
I actually like majority of them. Pretty much all of them. I can't really, have a downside to most of them. Solemnity is the one that kind of always catches me off guard. But then again, you're not really doing counters. And I mean, I don't know if it really like plays out the way that you want. I don't know how the meta is. You know, it might be decks that he runs into all the time. They're +1/+1 counters or whatnot.
Yeah.
So that card always catches me off guard. But I was thinking of a few other enchantments that I might consider adding. One of them is On Thin Ice. I know that he's talking about how he wants to use cards that are off the wall and people don't ever use. So, I mean, that's something that I don't think I've ever seen played.
Yeah.
Another one that I was thinking about was Legion's Landing. Just a simple fact of a 1-mana enchantment that gives you a token. It flips into a land that can keep giving you tokens. Just something that you can recur, because in mono white you have the issue of, I played so many cards out of my hand, I need to refill. What do I do that I can just keep putting mana into? And that's something you could do. The other thing is, I was thinking about Banishing Light and Oblivion Ring, because no one plays those anymore neither. So why not, because he said he wants to play cards that aren't really seen anymore. So that would be something that would work out too. And they remove anything aside from lands. So
a couple I will note that aren't here in this list we just looked at. There isn't a Anointed Procession in a deck that is making zombie tokens, and maybe right now it isn't that heavily clued into making tokens isn't the theme of the deck necessarily entirely, but I feel like even so, your commander making tokens, and like there's enough things built around bouncing creatures to remake the zombie, to make more zombies. I feel like it's probably worth it. But if you did tweak things in the direction of like ETB, make a token creatures, I would definitely run Anointed Procession. And it's just that it's good enough, I think, right now, but the more of those things you add, the better it gets. And talking about winning games, that's going to win you games. Cathar's Crusade, same thing. I think right now you have enough stuff. Even if you, like as it stands right now, if your commander's out and you cast a creature spell, that creature's going to come into play, which is going to make a zombie. You're putting 3 counters on all of your, 2 counters on your 3 creatures. And that's just with your commander out and you cast one thing. So basically the first creature you cast puts 2 counters on all of your things. That's really, really, really good value even before you lean into making more tokens. And I think if you go the direction of making more tokens, it gets that much better. It's a win condition as well. So if your deck's struggling to win, which is one of the things he said, as annoying as the card is, and it's annoying. That's the reason you don't run it, is it's annoying. It's also backbreaking.
Yes. So
that's one I would consider, as well as the new Felidar Retreat that was just in Zendikar Rising. It's a 4-mana enchantment that has landfall. Whenever a land enters battlefield under your control, choose one, and the 2 modes are create a 2/2 white cat beast creature token, which is fairly useful to just get a free token whenever you play a land. You don't need to spend mana to do it, you just get it. But the other option is put a +1 counter on each creature you control. And if you're at like 3 or 4 zombies out and your commander and a couple creatures already, making them +1 every single turn just from playing the lands that you're already going to be playing is pretty decent too. I think it's not as good as Cathar's Crusade here. I would definitely put Crusade in first, but like if you were going the token theme, the wider you go, the better that one gets as well. So I like that card, and I would consider it, particularly if things went into token land.
Yeah, I mean, you also have the age-old question of, do you run the anthems or not?
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
Seeing how it's a weenie base, the anthems would pump your creatures. That's always the hard to tough one for me too, is like, how many anthems do you run? Do you run them at all?
Exactly.
What do you do?
How about you, Max? Any thoughts on the enchantments here before we wrap things up?
I just have one, and it's all about recursion, and that's Sigil of the New Dawn. It's 4 mana, 3 and a white, but it says whenever a creature is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you may pay 1 and a white, and if you do, return that creature card to your hand. Just, if you're early game and you only have a couple creatures out and you drop this and someone board wipes or you block, you can pay the 2 mana, get it back in your hand, and then you can trigger Oketra next turn by casting it. Or, if you do kind of change the deck up to go more wide and it has an ETB value, it's just another way to get more value out of all your creatures.
Yeah, that's a good call. Good call. Okay. So we kind of touched on this a little bit already, or kind of wrap up when we're talking about the creatures, but any final thoughts from you guys about this deck before we sign off? I gave you mine about how if I was making big changes, I would definitely go that Army in the Can route where creatures make tokens on the ETB. But I do like it as it is. I think it's an interesting deck that runs a lot of kind of cool creatures, and there are advantages to going deep on one strategy in terms of tokens, but there's also advantages to just having a really diverse selection of creatures in your deck and not relying on one thing. So I get that as well. I like the deck as it is, but I also could see how you can make it a really cool token deck if you went that route. How about you, Chris? What are your final thoughts as we wrap up here?
I like the deck overall as it is. A few key cards in and out. I like the theme of going more stronger into ETB. Not necessarily token route like what you're suggesting, Dana, but more value of your enter the battlefields with a reanimating theme in general. Like, don't focus so hard on getting the tokens off of God Eternal, but more of each creature has its own value. It doesn't need other pieces to be valuable as it is. You could also look at, like I was saying, anthems and stuff to make your creatures bigger, because white is known for the creatures being weak and small. So any way that you can make them bigger to get through to get that final damage in will be really worth it in the long run.
How about you, Max? Final thoughts?
I like the deck how it is. I've played against a couple other God Eternal Oketra decks, and they are kind of more what you guys are suggesting, the Army in a Can, a lot of value from your creatures, and maybe Oketra is the, not the most important part. I also don't think Oketra is the most important part of this deck, but I really like seeing the uniqueness with the little bit of the taxing effects, along with all the board wipes. I think this is just more my playstyle, so I think that's why I like it this way over how you guys are recommending maybe doing a mass change.
Okay, well, that's going to wrap things up. We'd like to once again thank a listener and patron supporter, Brandon Hunter, for sharing his deck with us. Thanks a lot, Brandon. We do appreciate it. Very cool. And thanks for supporting the show and supporting all of us. If you out there would like to find us on the interwebs, you can find me on Twitter at Dana Roach. You can find Max at CMDRCentral_Max. And you can find Chris at WiseSquishy1. Our show is edited by Rafael Garcia, who does fantastic work each and every week. You can find him on Twitter at Ursa Bearwalker. And last but not least, our podcast theme is Retro Future Dirty by Kevin MacLeod, licensed via Creative Commons. We will be back next week with another show. Until then, I am Dana.
I'm Max.
And I'm Chris.